Donald Trump has won the presidency, capturing 277 electoral votes over his Democratic opponent Kamala Harris, and is set to become the 47th President of the United States. In a victory speech from Florida, Trump called this the greatest political movement ever and vowed to lead America toward recovery. Tonight, we will dive into what this win means for the country, the challenges ahead, and the reactions pouring in from across the U.S. and beyond. All this and more right after this. Hello there, dear viewers. I'm Kieran Zachary, and this is tonight's special. Before we bring in our guest for the debate and kick off the show tonight, I invite you to follow with me this report that sheds the light on the landslide victory of Republican candidate Donald Trump over Democratic Kamala Harris in the U.S. election, marking a historic return to the presidency. In a surprising twist, his Republican Party also swept control of both the House and the Senate, despite the criminal charges hanging over him. Let's get the details with Nabil Khazini.
Americans entered this election fully aware of Donald Trump's controversial past. At first glance, his political return seemed almost unimaginable. But despite facing criminal convictions, indictments, an assassination attempt, and accusations of authoritarianism, Donald Trump stages a remarkable comeback to power and becomes the new occupant of the White House. And this is where he will carry into the Oval Office promises on pressing issues including immigration, the economy, and the war in Gaza and in Ukraine.
Just as I did in my first term, we had a great first term, a great first term. I will govern by a simple motto: promises made, promises kept. We're going to keep our promises. Nothing will stop me from keeping my word to you, the people. We will make America safe, strong, prosperous, powerful, and free again.
Trump's fellow Republicans successfully regained control of the U.S. Senate, shifting the balance of power away from the Democrats. At the same time, they appeared poised to potentially strengthen their narrow majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. However, with several key races still too close to call, the final results in the House are expected to remain uncertain for several more days. This resounding Republican victory highlighted the growing sense of frustration among Americans.
Last night I was watching the whole election the whole night. The whole thing, and I'm like, oh my God, Trump's about to win. And then when he won, I was like, oh my God, let's make America great again.
I feel that they should do a recount on the election because I feel like Donald Trump should not win the election. And I just want to see what the future holds for us.
Donald Trump will serve as the 47th U.S. president for 4 years, and while his 2016 win was described as a leap into the political unknown, this time Americans know exactly who Trump is, and they have chosen to give him a second chance.
All right, now let's turn to our special invite to Washington, D.C., Lemia Shoes. Hello there, Lemia. Can you tell us what's the update on the ground? What can you tell us in general? And what are the reactions following Donald Trump's confirmed return to the presidency? And what priorities are Americans setting for this coming term?
Right, so it has been indeed a historic win for Republican candidate Donald Trump. Unprecedented election win. We've expected these elections to be so close. They've always been neck and neck. And since we've been here in Washington merely a week ago, we've been reporting that the margin is really tight between both candidates. So we expected either of them to win with a very small margin. That has not been the case, shockingly so. We were yesterday present at Howard University with with the Kamala Harris campaign staff, and where they were holding a watch party for the elections. And we've seen how the festive atmosphere from her base transformed from, joy and anticipation and hope into slow and painful disappointment as Donald Trump was declared the winner of state after state. And then, hope really started going down once he started winning those crucial swing states. Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Wisconsin, and that sealed the deal for Donald Trump. We've seen in real time how the Kamala Harris camp was really disappointed. Some of them were even in tears, Karim. So it has been brutal. The sentiment here in Washington, D.C., which is a very liberal city full of Democrats, is one of sadness. You can feel the disappointment as D.C. woke up to the news that Donald Trump was elected president. Even the pace of the results, the preliminary results were announced, we were not expecting them to be announced so soon. So that has been the atmosphere here. We just left Howard University, where Kamala Harris conceded the elections. She gave her concession speech, and let me tell you, the crowd there was so moved. Her speech was full of hope, and she was rallying her base, telling them to not lose hope, telling them to keep the faith and to never give up. She also just said from Howard University, not far from here, that her and her staff will do whatever it takes and will do the necessary measures to facilitate the transition for the Trump administration. So yeah, Karim, that's been the mood here in Washington, one of sadness, one of disappointment for how these crucial presidential elections have gone.
Clear, Lamia. Thank you so much. All right, Lamia Ashush, you were live with us from Washington, D.C. Let me now turn to our guest from Boston, USA, is Mr. Christopher Isayu, Foreign Policy and International Affairs Analyst. And from Virginia, USA, is Mr. James Bowden, research historian and Middle East expert. Thank you, gentlemen, for agreeing to be with us. Also, we're glad to welcome from Los Angeles, California, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Associate Dean Professor of International Studies, California State University. Thank you, Dr. Hamoud, for agreeing to be with us again.
Always a pleasure, Karim. Thank you.
Thank you. And along with Dr. Abdenour Toumi, geopolitical researcher and journalistic author from Paris, France. Thank you all, gentlemen, for agreeing to be with us. And let me start with you, Mr. James Bowden. So Donald Trump has eventually made it, after all. I mean, to many, this did not come as a surprise, including myself. I've always said Donald Trump is the next 47th president of the United States, for so many obvious reasons, that is. Now, how did you yourself see this victory, and why are the Democrats acting like this was not an expected outcome, let's say?
Well, I was actually a bit surprised myself. Watching the media presentations daily, just viewing the headlines and getting into some of the stories, the media portrayal made it seem that the election was just a mere formality, that Kamala Harris was going to be elected, no problem, and we just needed to get the vote underway. There was also a lot of positive news for her in the mail-in balloting, which had begun a few weeks before. And so that trend had signaled a likely Harris victory. And so when I tuned in, when I was able to start watching the election coverage and I saw Donald Trump up and how things were developing, I was actually very surprised. Now, looking at the weeds, looking into the minutia of the votes, this was a very close run. I mean, this was an election where many of the votes were separated only by a few thousand votes. I've been hearing that it was a complete landslide, or a big sweep for Donald Trump. But in reality, it was very close. I kind of expected that maybe at least one or two of the states that were being called as leaning Republican were actually going to change overnight, just simply based on how narrow it was.
Thank you indeed. What about you, Dr. Hamoud Sarhi? How did you take this news? I mean, if we're talking about the Democrats, I mean, what did the Democrats actually do wrong to lose this election?
Well, I think the biggest problem, Harris, the Democrat Party started late. 3 months or less than 3 months is simply not enough to run a campaign. So it's so unfair to the Democrat candidate to lead and be expected to win. But certainly there were some signs. We just missed them. Those of us who thought that Trump is well known and Harris was doing so well with energizing the political party. I think in a week or 10 days before the campaign, we started to see some questioning. The Harris started to disappear from the news segments. And this is where Donald Trump is very famous at. He kept himself on the news. But what happened to Harris in the last maybe 2 weeks or so, there was so many negative about how she was handling the campaign. There was also a new narrative that came and proved to be very important to look at, that the male African American will not vote for her, or she was having trouble doing that. And this is really typical of the difference between how the Republicans and how the Democrats campaign. The Republicans stayed positive, and they always do positive with their candidate. No matter what Trump does, there is always a narrative that favors him and bring him as a very, very strong leader from their perspective. The Democrat, the other way around, they seem to be always critical, looking at the more about making analytical point rather than the political consequences. So that's number one, the idea of how. Number two is that when you look at probably this is, as some put it, is the problem with the incumbent. Regardless of how we presented Kamala Harris is part of the established White House, who is in the White House. You look at the data, 33 out of 5, according to certain reports, thought that Biden was not doing a good job. 3 also out of 4 believed that the country is leading into the different directions. So what happened? What the American voters choose is certainty over uncertainty, meaning that they know Trump has all these problems. But Trump was perceived as a businessman, someone who could do much better to help their lives, considering the challenges that the Americans are facing in terms of the inflation, high prices, all of that. So they went with someone, they despite all the negative things about him, despite their belief system, they thought Trump will provide the solution. The challenge is that what kind of solution, and will Trump serve them, and where is this going? So there were a lot of challenges, but this was, in fact, in my understanding, timing is very, very important. The other one is the inability of the Democrats to run a cohesive, an articulated message, in a time where it was expected of Harris to promote herself, to be known throughout the United States. Perhaps the time was not the right one.
Very good. So the time factor was a decisive one for the Democratic Party. Now, Mr. Christopher Isayu, do you think the Democrats had a chance to win, or was it a lost cause from the very beginning? Mr. Hamoud Sarhi was highlighting the time factor that maybe did not serve them.
Yes, thanks, Karim. I think under very tight circumstances, it was their first candidate, and really the candidate that most Democrats backed was Joe Biden up until he dropped out. I think that there was a problem with cohesiveness, and I think there was a problem with messaging. I think one problem that Ms. Harris did was she didn't face head on the criticisms that Trump had of her on immigration and on the economy. When she had a chance to differentiate herself from the Biden administration in terms of what she would have done different writ large, primarily on the economy and on immigration, she didn't. She said nothing. And so on a or national interview, primetime interview. So I think that was part of the mistake. I definitely think they had a chance. I think their chances were slimmer than the Republicans, because the Republicans did have a unified message and a unified candidate. However, I think that in the beginning, Mrs. Harris did gain a lot of momentum, but she just wasn't able to sustain it ultimately.
And what about you, Dr. Abdunnoor Toumi? You and I have had several discussions before, and we both expected a Donald Trump return. Why was this so obvious for those who are not perhaps following?
Good evening, and thank you for having me on the show, and special greeting for your distinguished guest. Actually, yes, indeed. And all this drama that the campaign and American voters went through in the last 3 months, particularly, started with the withdrawal of the outgoing president, Joe Biden. And this was actually the turning point in these elections, because Vice President Harris actually was kind of second choice. But she did jump in the race, and she led a campaign. However, the question was, it's not about did the pundits underestimated Donald Trump. Actually, it's the other way around. They, however, did overestimated the performance of Kamala Harris. So now we are there, and for the Democrats, if they have something or somebody to blame, it's just about this loss, it's just about themselves, because they made a strategic mistake, and especially the candidate, Vice President, outgoing Vice President Kamala Harris, who did not focus on the two issues actually concerning domestic policy, is immigration and the inflation. She did focus on the main character, and he loved it actually on Donald Trump. That was a strategic mistake. Now, and the other big mistake that she did is about her standing and her clear position on the carnage that is taking place in Palestine, and that it's a repercussion of that unjust war that now is in Lebanon. So in the end of the day, actually, Donald Trump, elect President Donald Trump did win, and American voters gave him a mandate, actually, and he earned a political capital. Now we'll see how the President-elect Donald Trump second administration will be different from the first one in 2016, 2020.
Thank you indeed. Back to you, Mr. James Baldwin. What do Americans hope to see from Donald Trump following his return to the presidency, especially after his 2020 defeat to Biden?
I would definitely say they're focused on the economy. In conversations that I have with different colleagues and friends, many people want to stop having to be on a two-income type of lifestyle where you have to have both spouses working, maybe even sometimes even the children working to help support the economy. When you get your paycheck and then you go and you find that it covers rent and barely covers the groceries and you have very little left over, then you tend to get very panicked. So I really believe that the greatest emphasis for Americans and what they really expect is that Donald Trump will bring down inflation, as has been mentioned, and we'll get the economy functioning in such ways that it's going to be pro-family, pro-provider, and able to get some of the other problems that are related to that under control, especially rent and housing. Housing is another major issue that many Americans are very worried about. We've got record homelessness here in America, and we need to get that under control. But post-pandemic, there are a lot of renters that have jacked up their prices. We've seen ballooning rents and also ballooning regulations for renting that many Americans cannot meet. And so Americans will definitely, always be very reliable on voting with their wallet, first and foremost. And so those are things that are most looked for.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Christopher Isayu, like James Bolden was saying that there were a lot of problems at the domestic front and a lot of homelessness there, housing crisis. And we see that despite Harris's focus in her election campaign on the middle class, she still lost the bet. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a few things. I think what's interesting is my colleague who just spoke previously to me said something interesting, that a pro-provider. I'm not sure, because many women now, many families want to be double income, and the cost of living, which the president has no control over. The market sets the price, not the president. The president of the United States only has two levers of financial control. That's monetary policy and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is how you spend money, and monetary policy is the raising or lowering of interest rates. So I think that we can't conflate, people's choices with the economic situation. On paper, the American economy is doing quite well. The problem is inflation. There have been several factors to do with inflation, but as my colleague just also mentioned, very much the average American is feeling it in the pocketbook, and so that's why I think that people, whether it's true or not, trusted Donald Trump more on the economy, which is interesting, because in contrast, they trusted Joe Biden more back in 2020 after they had seen what the first Trump presidency really meant. So I think it's all a matter of perception. There's an old saying in politics and academics and everything else that, perception is reality. So I just think, again, it was a failure of communication on the Harris camp to articulate her own, first of all, separation of what she would do from about what Biden's unpopular policies were, and how she could directly challenge the economy and immigration.
Mm-hmm. Back to you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. With many domestic promises to fulfill and international challenges ahead, what will be Trump's top priorities when he takes office, particularly in terms of domestic issues? And we spoke already about economy here.
As my colleague said there is a very important point to look at. I think the economy will remain the best one. And despite the challenges, I think he'll do very well. I'll tell you why. Because when you look at the numbers, the inflation is very down. The interest rates are not really bad. They're also down, and it's most likely they will go down further. The prices and all of that, really more of like a local state level more than the federal government. The guest before me noted the difference between monetary and fiscal policies, and those are very, very important. But I think what the Biden administration would leave, President would leave Trump, is a healthy economy on the micro level. The idea is, with the perception that now we have somebody in charge who knows the economy, they could do better. But then, also connect it. We are sort of in a state of war. The United States is spending so much on the on assisting with the war in Ukraine and participating in it, and the things that we've seen in Lebanon and Gaza. These are all huge expenses. So that the economy will be the first one. The second one, I could say, is also foreign policy. Trump, if we hear him very well, he wants the wars to be over. So probably that's his second focus. And it could be an idea that the Biden administration and the new administration could come up to some kind of resolutions to ensure that, a conflict is put to end.
Thank you indeed. Let me turn now to Dr. Abdunnoor Toumi. Many observers have noted that Trump in 2024 is a different figure compared to 2020. Do you perceive this shift through his media appearances, maybe the campaign strategies and statements following his victory?
Actually, he did appear poised and to some extent appeasing to his supporters in Florida this morning, actually American time. Whereas the attitude and I would say the style or the governance style of President-elect Donald Trump definitely will change, and we are going, or we will be seeing and following another Donald Trump that we know and also that we knew in his previous administration, and also because actually he is, in the end, I mean, if I may say that, of his dream, because I mean, he achieved, I mean, actually he reached the highest level of achievement in his life, I mean, to be fair to the man. And actually it's an interesting story for the future. And for sure, I mean, this persona, I mean, will mark American politics history, and we will be talking about him for decades ahead. Now, as long as his policies go, actually, and he will be facing, and as my dear colleagues stated, and focus on the economy issue, because this is where actually the majority of American voters did vote for him, because I mean economy is his strongest point, but now is foreign policy, and notably the Middle East, because we all know what's going on, and also we know the President-elect Donald Trump Middle East policy in his previous administration. So on this point, actually, there is that dynamic of as former President Bill Clinton stated, essential continuity. Actually, there is not much difference between Democrats or Republicans when it comes to the Middle East, but this time we are in a paradigm shift as a result of the Al-Aqsa flood operation, and then the overreaction of the carnage that is taking place in Gaza. So he made actually a clear statement saying that he will end this war, actually, and even the other war that is taking place in Europe as well. But now we will see how the main actually actors or belligerents will react. Now, the people in the region don't care much, if not at all, because they know that actually no administration will be looking at their legitimate cause, notably for the Palestinians. But this is a challenge, and he needs to actually not to fix it, but at least to visit, and if he could make a pressure on the Israeli leaders. On the other hand, we know what happened under his administration, and he doesn't hide it, and he is pro-Israel, and he is, very close friend, actually very interesting. All the Israeli leaders and people today, they were chanting and happy about his election because, he gave them actually almost anything they wanted. It started from the transfer of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Al-Aqsa al-Sharif and the recognition of the annexion of the Golan Heights to the settlers as well. It gave them almost what they wanted about their harsh comportment and even policies, because there is a policy is said coming from Smotrich in the West Bank. So all these elements are, on the table, and he needs to look at them attentively.
Thank you indeed. And speaking of the war in Europe and more specifically Russia-Ukraine, Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov stated on Wednesday that President Vladimir Putin remains open to dialogue with the United States. He added that it will become clear whether the U.S. administration's stance changes when Donald Trump begins his presidency next January. In a press briefing about the U.S. election results, Peskov acknowledged that relations between Moscow and Washington are currently at their lowest point. He also mentioned that he is unsure whether President Putin plans to congratulate Trump on his victory. Meanwhile, the Russian Foreign Ministry officially congratulated Donald Trump on his electoral win. And in a statement, they emphasized that Trump's calls to end conflicts must be followed by tangible actions that can guide global efforts toward peace.
It's almost impossible for US-Russia relations to worsen further, their lowest historical level, and what happens next depends on the next US leader. President Putin has consistently expressed his openness to constructive dialogue based on fairness and equality and considers everyone's concerns. For now, the US administration stands in stark opposition. We'll see what happens in January.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky expressed optimism about achieving a just peace in Ukraine following Donald Trump's victory in the US presidential election. In a tweet on X, Zelensky voiced hope for the swift realization of peace in Ukraine and emphasized his desire to strengthen the strategic partnership between Kiev and Washington. He also praised what he called Trump's commitment to promoting peace in global affairs.
I appreciate President Trump's commitment to the peace through strength approach in global affairs. This is exactly the principle that can practically bring just peace to Ukraine closer. We look forward to an era of a strong United States of America under President Trump's decisive leadership. We rely on continued strong bipartisan support for Ukraine in the United States.
Back to you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. We see there is optimism from both conflicting parties, Russia and Ukraine. Are we really expecting a quick resolution and a final solution to this war in just 24 hours of Donald Trump in office, just like he promised in his campaign? Or it's more complicated than the political talk he threw around in his presidential campaign?
Well, he did say he will live up to his promises and he will deliver. I think the reality is different. This is a very, very complicated situation. The situation or the relationship that existed between Donald Trump and Putin during his term, the previous term, we did not have this conflict. We had more areas of looking for ways how to recognize each other's strength, if you want. The Trump administration at the time should have if they were really interested in ensuring Russia's worries about their national security, is to follow through or to adopt or to put in application the agreements that Russia had with the Europeans, including and the Americans, that NATO would not expand, and that the treaty they had before, I believe, could have been taken at the time by signing, perhaps making Ukraine a buffer zone or anything of the sort that would lead us to some kind of relationship that will avoid the war. The situation is very different, and today the Russians have leverage. They've proven that they could do this war as long as they want, and then Trump may opt to the other way around because he strongly believes that the European should be sort of in charge of their own Europe, and that he doesn't want to get involved in conflict on behalf of the European. So he would look to the interest of the United States, and by that I mean both countries have interests that go beyond just Europe. They have interests in Africa and other parts of the world. So it's a very, very challenging situation, but Karim, I don't think this is a matter of 24 hours, as he stated. It will take a long time. The situations have changed, and I could sort of venture to say that the relationship between the two presidents will be much, much different than before. I don't think when Trump starts to look at the issues and will have the same position, calling Putin as his friend, only if he decides to withdraw and it leaves the European handles or the Ukrainian handles their own thing, and that's far from happening.
Thank you indeed. What about you, Mr. James Baldwin? Do you agree? Is Russia really going to see the tangible actions of Donald Trump to end the war in Ukraine? And if so, what mechanisms and measures do you think President-elect Donald Trump is going to opt for? And what are your guesses in general?
In all honesty, they would be guesses because my expertise is in the Middle East, and I've been focusing on it exclusively to the neglect of the Ukraine conflict. The only thing that I've really noted of great interest was the interjection of the North Korean troops into the conflict. And with the amount of troops that have been brought into the conflict and are scheduled to come in, I don't see any effort on the part of Vladimir Putin to quickly back out of this campaign. If anything, he is trying to double down and trying to come to a conclusion with this fresh injection of troops. And that is something that Donald Trump is going to confront. He's going to confront a Putin who has been able to have a long enduring conflict in the region. We have had a significant investment in supporting Ukraine, especially through arms shipments, but we have seen in the past that that's not how Donald Trump would prefer to operate. I think that he will try to work through various more economic incentives to try to get Putin to move out of Ukraine and to unwind these actions if he can. But I definitely agree that it's not going to be a 24-hour type of arrangement, and I don't think that it's going to happen by the inauguration. And again, that's definitely been driven home by the fact that these troops are in there just now. And so again, I don't see any walking back of the conflict.
Let me include here Dr. Abdenour Toumi. Dr. Abdenour, I wonder, did Donald Trump really bite more than he can chew when he made that promise to end the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Actually, as my dear colleagues, my previous speakers stated, it's not going to be solved in the next 24 hours or in the next 6 months. It is a complex issue. And of course, I mean, we know, again, the style and of President-elect Donald Trump when he says something in the campaign, it's not going to be translated automatically in practice. I mean, it takes time, and there are many imperatives that will be shaping his decision. And also, the conflict now is entering its third year, and there are other actors who are involved. And also, I mean, the Americans, the Biden administration did spend a lot of time and money as well. So all this will bring to the issue how he can manage, or how his negotiation skill will be, I mean, having some impact on both leaders, on Zelensky as on Putin. So, I mean, this is why it is a complex issue, and also it depends to some European countries, I mean, notably Germany, I mean, who has a say in this. And so how, again, on the bilateral level, how President-elect Donald Trump will shape his relation with Germany, so that with France. And we saw President Macron did congratulate President-elect Trump early, and he was, I think, among the first foreign leaders who did congratulate him. I mean, looking forward to work together. I mean, there are only bilateral issues, but there is these integral issues such as NATO and also the Ukraine war impasse.
Yeah, so of course there are a lot of issues to be discussed at the table. Now, if we focus again on the issue of Russia-Ukraine, Trump criticized Biden and his administration for failing to manage the war in Ukraine during his election campaign. And earlier, Mr. James Bolden highlighted the fact that maybe the way Donald Trump is going to handle the situation is going to be merely economic, maybe with more economic incentives, maybe lifting the sanctions on Russia. Do you think this is possible, Dr. Abdenour? Well, it seems that Dr. Abdenour, to me, you can't hear me?
I can't. I didn't get the last part of the question.
Yeah, so what I meant is that, is it really possible to see some kind of economic incentives to push for a solution in the Russia-Ukraine file?
Actually, this is the strategy of the negotiation of the new President-elect Donald Trump. I mean, because again, we are saying actually he is pro-Russia, or he is close friend to Putin. I mean, it's not that close, because on the other hand, I mean, he doesn't want to lose Ukraine, because Ukraine is still a solid and the pillar in the U.S. Interest in the region. So what he can do, I mean, he can put pressure, of course, and there is the energy card, and we know that President Putin has been using this card to the European countries, and I mean, avoiding the sanction. So Donald Trump can bring him on this card, as well as he can put some pressure on Zelensky about the American aid. And therefore, I mean, these two cards Donald Trump has in his hand, he can bring the two leaders to the negotiation table. But again, I mean, it's still too early to talk about this, because it takes time and the situation is
so it's not that simple, the bottom line. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Abdenour. Toumi, let me bring here Christopher Isayu. Do you think maybe the close ties Trump developed with Putin during his previous term could help pave the way for renewed negotiations between Moscow and the West?
Well, that's a tricky question. There's a few things I'd like to address. One thing is we already know that Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has already said that solving the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's not a Ukraine-Russian conflict. It was actually a Russian invasion and some would argue attempted genocide of the Ukrainian people by Russia.
Well, that's your opinion. I think Putin has a different argument, right?
Yeah, I'm sure he does have a different argument. But the fact of the matter is he's a wanted war criminal for invading Ukraine. He, as per old Soviet doctrine, he routinely targets the civilian population. So there's many arguments for many experts like Professor Timothy Snyder and others that have essentially said it's a genocide. Putin is under indictment by The Hague. He is wanted as a war criminal. So I do add those two things in.
I mean, you went there like a very harsh. Well, these are your opinion, and you need to be responsible for that, right? Like,
it's not just my opinion. These are the opinion of other experts in the field. So it's a fact that Putin invaded Ukraine. I don't see that that's a fact of opinion.
Well, you don't see it. You don't see it like maybe President Putin was provoked and dragged into this war for maybe protecting his country.
There's arguments on either side. I don't think it was provoked. And as a matter of fact, if there was anyone who broke a treaty, it was Russia and Putin that broke the treaty in 2013 by invading initially Crimea. It was called the 1992 Budapest Memorandum, by which Russia, the United States, and Germany guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. So if there was anyone who was provoked, it was actually Ukraine. It wasn't the expansion of NATO. There may be some concessions that maybe Putin had some concerns about, NATO expansion supposedly on the Russian border, but Ukraine is not a buffer zone. Ukraine is a sovereign country with a great sovereign people that has its own rich history. And so having just recently hosted a delegation of Ukrainians for the U.S. Congress here in Boston, I know that I was told also that Ukrainians will fight to the last person. I also know that in the U.S., there is a lot of bipartisan support for Ukraine to succeed, whether that means that they can be occupied of all of their territory of Russians. That's another story. So I don't think it's going to be that easy for President-elect Trump to negotiate with Putin on an individual basis. However,
but continuing to defend Ukraine the way they're doing. I mean, he's been complaining about the big budget, and he even described Zelensky to be some kind of a businessman who comes to the United States and take billions and billions of dollars and go home.
I mean, that's a matter of opinion as well. I think that's a false assessment. Mr. Zelensky has actually a decent relationship with President Trump, and the aid that Mr. Zelensky has gotten has actually already been paid for by the U.S. taxpayer. That's not fresh money that is coming out of the U.S.'s coffers. It's old military surplus that has been supplied to Ukraine, which is immediately resupplied by new military contracts that actually help the Pentagon and the U.S. industrial military complex and create jobs in the United States. So there's a few, different and I think misinformation that may be going on there. Now, whether or not Trump can capitalize on a personal relationship with Putin, that remains to be seen. I don't think it's back to business as usual. I think the Europeans don't want to do business with Mr. Putin again. And Russia's not the power that it was even in 2014. Putin has lost 600,000 men, and Russia's a shadow of its former self. So.
Thank you, Mr. Christopher Isayu. Let me just include Dr. Hamoud Sarhi as we're about to conclude. So, Dr. Hamoud, simply put, what do you think of our distinguished guest's opinion regarding this file, and how do you expect the lifting maybe of sanctions by the U.S. on Russia to unfold in case they come to an agreement?
This is a line of argument that you find in the United States. There are big supporters who think that the United States should do more to support Ukraine. And they all think that Russia is the same as the former Soviet Union. But historically, we see that the West disappointed the Russian at the collapse of the Cold War. And we have now a secret document that stated very, very clearly to the Soviet Union at the time that the United States and and the Western Europe will respect the sovereignty of Russia, that they will not expand NATO. And these are documents. This is not like anybody saying it. So that's what we are. So going back, whether this is Russia's fault or the Korean fault, Russia has to find a way to protect its national interest. And in that case specifically, when you have an expansion of NATO to the degree it has been doing, the Russian must be nervous. And more than anything, what does Russia have a way of protecting its national interest? Now, on the American side, we are, the idea of creating an enemy, of creating a justification for military spending and going after finding an enemy. Russia has sort of, and China appears to be the part of that Cold War mentality that the United States have yet to get rid of. So certainly I could hear our guest argument, but it is one view of many that we have here in the United States. It remains to be seen historically, and when we talk about historical facts, and which our guest talks about, you should go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the kind of promises that the West promised to Russia at the time, and in that context, with this certainly that NATO's existence was no longer needed because Warsaw Pact collapsed. I mean, they got rid of it, and NATO was created initially to protect the Western Europe from the United States, the alliance, as you want, from the Soviet Union. With the end of the Soviet Union, it was only a matter of logic. You get rid of NATO. You don't expand it. You start building economic ties to integrate Russia into Europe. And that's what the Russian wants at the time. They want to be a part of Europeans, but the Americans and other Europeans saw this as an opportunity to expand and to give NATO a new role with the premise that we still have an enemy. And if it's not the Islamist terrorist that NATO indicated in early 90s, it's later on, it's Russia during the time about 2013 or so. So history has its own ways, but as analysis and followers, we have to look at the historical and read the history from a comprehensive perspective, regardless of the interest of the policymakers. Yeah.
Thank you indeed. And Dr. Abdunnoor Toumi, I give you the final 2 minutes before we conclude, if you have anything to add.
Actually, it's a very interesting discussion, and of course it takes hours to wrap up all these complex issues. But there is an interesting point I wanted to make about these elections, American elections. Actually, what President-elect Donald Trump did, he did imploded the political parties, both Republicans and Democrats. Now he took over on the Republican Party, and the Democrats now are in disarray, and they should look for another strategy, because sure, after this loss, they will be evaluated the consequences of their loss. So, and Americans are happy about this unconventional politician that is actually has become a storytelling in America, and he will be having a strong legacy and entered American pop culture. So, and of course, America, it's still America, and there is another interesting note here is American democracy is still healthy, and the process is working at still a state of law, and checks and balances are there. And in the end of the day, Americans did vote and ended all this drama that the world was watching, and many of them, particularly the pundits here in Europe and particularly in France, they were looking for chaos and not to get the result by the early afternoon. They were hoping for a long series like we did experience 24 years ago in Florida.
Thank you indeed, Dr. Abdunnoor Toumi. Before I conclude, I mean, this discussion got really hot and interesting, and I want Mr. James Bolden to tell me, as an American, an average American, are Americans really happy paying those taxes in wars, financing wars, or maybe they want to see their money going somewhere where it is much needed, such as building more houses and saving the homeless, and maybe creating more opportunities, job opportunities, Mr. James Bolden?
Well, Americans are a people who will definitely support a war that they see as being just and as being very vital to the American interest. Americans have not really supported, or there are Americans who don't support the war and our engagement with Ukraine against Russia, because we don't see the benefit of it to American foreign policy, which has gotten along very well and very fine without Ukraine being free and independent of Russia for a very long time. Mm-hmm. So it just really comes down to what is the purpose, what is the meaning. And if there's a good meaning, a good purpose, then people will push that military support to the nth degree. And that is why you see such a great, overwhelming flood of support for Israel, because a lot of Americans see the Israeli cause, rightly or wrongly, being just and of actually being more in their inherent interest than the outcome in Ukraine. And so, it just really, it's on a very conflict by conflict basis. You can't lay down anything as a carpet statement that says this war, all wars are going to be accepted or all wars are going to be rejected. It's going to be very circumstantial.
Mm-hmm. But I don't think that the average American can actually see that, and that they would actually want to see the money going somewhere more fruitful for their economy. Just so as Christopher Isaiah wouldn't get upset, briefly, a final word.
No, I think that there's different arguments to be had, Kareem, and I don't think it was getting heated, but again, you have to look at it from the big perspective, but facts are the facts, and there was the Budapest Memorandum, and Russia did invade Ukraine. And actually, prior to 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea, which was denounced by the United Nations, if you ask the average Ukrainian about NATO, they wouldn't even have been able to tell you what it was. So it wasn't really until Russia actually provoked NATO expansion. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg situation. Mm-hmm. For example, Finland and Sweden were both not NATO members. After Russia invaded Ukraine, they became NATO members. So in many ways, Mr. Putin himself is the best recruiter for NATO.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Christopher Isaiah, for all those insights. I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to all our panelists. Dr. Hamoud Salhi, you're going to have to stay with us for part 2. Mr. James Bolden, thank you so much. Dr. Abdunnoor Toumi, thank you. And for you and I, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, we have a further appointment with our dear viewers and other panelists after this break.
Behind the screens, political battles rage in the United States. Some TV stations fiercely defend the Republican Party, while others seem to speak for the Democrats. So, what is the extent of political bias in American media? And how does the fourth estate influence voters' minds? The strongest news stations in the United States are divided into 3 categories. Right-leaning conservative ones include Fox News, Newsmax, and OAN. Left-leaning ones are led by CNN, MSNBC, and CBS News. Stations known for balanced coverage include NBC News and ABC News. Does political money tempt the media? Generally, no. Media bias is more about the political ideology of the channel owners, as American law prohibits parties from funding media outlets. For example, Fox News provides unlimited support to Donald Trump. Major media like the New York Times describe Fox News as Trump's propaganda machine. This is due to 2 main reasons. First, the channel's founder, billionaire Rupert Murdoch, has right-wing conservative leanings and sees his media projects as opportunities to promote his ideas. Second, Fox News gained significant fame and success due to the loyalty of its conservative audience. At one point, it was one of the most influential channels in America. Thus, it became a media outlet that creates news to appeal to the audience feelings rather than just reporting it. This is the view of Tom Rosenthal, an executive director at the American Press Institute. This suggests that the indirect goal might be money, as building a large audience in America and being able to influence it means billions of dollars in advertising. Advertising companies prefer to invest in media outlets with a specific and loyal audience. This might explain why Fox News sought to rebuild its relationship with Trump after it collapsed last year. The right-wing station's goal is not to win Trump's favor, but to maintain its large audience in the United States. There is an old equation in media and politics that says the influence of journalism on citizens increases significantly with neutrality, and the opposite is true. Biased media may maintain the trust of a segment of the audience, but lose others entirely. In a survey published by Gallup last year, it was found that 39% of Americans have no trust in the media, the highest recorded number in 5 decades. The impact of media bias doesn't stop there. With trust in American media at historic lows, according to Gallup data, Americans are questioning how the 2024 election results will unfold with this phenomenon and whether polarization will lead to political explosion.
Brothers and sisters from across the world.
The SSN-AUKUS submarine, a groundbreaking nuclear vessel combining British design, US firepower, and Australian manufacturing ambition, represents more than just military innovation. With a staggering price tag of $250 billion, it marks Australia's entrance into the elite nuclear submarine club amidst growing tensions in the Pacific, especially in relation to China. However, this strategic shift has left one major Western power in disarray: France. France had secured a $66 billion deal to supply Australia with diesel-powered submarines. But when Australia scrapped this agreement for AUKUS, it wasn't merely a financial loss, it was a blow to national pride. Macron publicly accused the Australian Prime Minister of deceit, an outburst that nearly derailed EU-Australia trade discussions. Despite France's outrage, the deal proceeded. For Australia, the allure of advanced nuclear capabilities was too great to resist. Washington prioritized its geopolitical strategy and economic gains, even at France's expense. This fallout highlights a broader issue: the emerging fractures between the US and its European allies, revealing that their unity may be more circumstantial than cohesive. To understand the complexities of US-European relations, we must look back to their origins. In the early 17th century, European settlers established colonies in North America, driven by the promise of riches. Tobacco, rather than gold, became the cornerstone of colonial wealth, and soon European powers dominated the continent. This relationship was inherently complicated. While European powers exploited resources and enslaved millions, the colonies began to seek their independence. The American Revolution in 1776 marked a significant rupture. Though political ties were severed, Europe's cultural and economic influence remained strong. As the United States flourished, Europe still held sway until the devastation of World War I. The United States initially remained neutral during World War I, profiting from its distance. However, after German attacks on US ships, it entered the war. The conflict ended with the Allies' victory, but the United States emerged relatively unscathed, financially robust, while Europe lay in ruins. In World War II, the United States again maintained neutrality until attacked. Once involved, its military and industrial capabilities dwarfed those of its allies. The post-war era solidified US dominance as Europe faced division along the Iron Curtain. The Cold War reinforced the transatlantic alliance. Europe, recovering from war, leaned on US military and economic support, embodied in initiatives like the Marshall Plan. Yet this dependence fostered resentment, especially as US nuclear weapons were stationed across Europe. The 1960s saw a shift as French leader Charles de Gaulle sought to diminish US influence, advocating for European autonomy. His withdrawal from NATO's military command was a bold statement of intent. The 1970s brought further tensions. The Nixon shock disrupted European economies, and as the US shifted focus to Asia, Europe felt sidelined. Yet reliance on US military support persisted. In the 1980s, despite relative calm, Reagan's assertive policies sowed discord within Europe. But the shared threat of Soviet communism maintained cohesion. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 shifted NATO's purpose. As the US dismantled some bases, Europe began to forge its own identity, culminating in the creation of the European Union. The War on Terror briefly united the alliance. But the 2003 Iraq invasion highlighted deep divisions. The US labeled France and Germany as part of old Europe for their opposition. Obama's presidency aimed to rebuild bridges, particularly after Russia's actions in Ukraine. While the United States' engagement increased, doubts about US commitment lingered, especially following troops' withdrawal.
That looks a little bad.
Under Trump, the relationship soared dramatically. His America First stance questioned the NATO's values, leading to troop reductions and leaving Europe questioning its security reliance. Biden's administration has sought to mend ties amid the Ukraine crisis, rejuvenating NATO's purpose. However, the scars from recent history, particularly Trump's presidency, still cast a shadow. Looking ahead, a potential return of Trump poses uncertainty for Europe. Conversely, a Harris presidency may offer Europe a more consistent ally, particularly as it grapples with security challenges on its borders.
you, everyone.
The AUKUS submarine deal transcends mere business. It symbolizes the evolving dynamics of US-European relations. As global power structures shift, the question remains, can the United States and Europe maintain their unity in an increasingly multipolar world? Or will historical grievances drive them apart?
Hello again, dear viewers. And before we answer those two questions raised in that report, I'd like to highlight other highlights in the Republican candidate Donald Trump winning, who hailed his victory in the US presidential elections as a historic achievement, attributing it to hard work and determination. However, observers are viewing his return to the White House as a blank check granted to him by the Biden administration, given its performance over the past 4 years. We follow the report and then we get back to the debate with our panelists.
Trump returns to the White House awaiting the big day of the U.S. Electoral College decision. However, the news first shared by Trump himself has stirred many questions about the Democratic significant setbacks in the face of the Republican elephant's advance, especially compared to the last U.S. election. Triumphant in this historic moment,
We have taken back control of the Senate.
Trump described the political activity in states like Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona as a great movement that brought him back to the presidential residence on Pennsylvania Avenue. His past could be read as an act of retribution for the 2020 election setback, which was marked by unprecedented tensions across the United States. As the U.S. awaits the results of its biggest electoral event, some speculate that the ghosts of numerous civilian casualties in Gaza, women, children, and others affected by the ongoing conflict, allegedly fueled by U.S. support, may have contributed to the harsh losses for the Democrats. Many Americans who oppose these Middle Eastern policies may have transformed their frustration into votes against Vice President Kamala Harris and the Democrats, with Harris also losing significant support among Arab and Muslim communities. Furthermore, the Biden administration's handling of the Ukraine war, coupled with what some sees as misjudgments engaging its developments, proved to be an advantage seized by the former president. Many American voters have seen no clear strategic accomplishment from the U.S. involvement, only financial strains on the U.S. Treasury in the form of billions in military aid to Ukraine and support for the Zionist entity. To American eyes, these are costly errors, as these issues matter less to the average American than the economic pressures they cause, seen in inflation and rising prices. Facing a choice between blue and red, American voters find themselves under the leadership of a man with criminal indictments. Trump's main focus seems to be striking deals that may override constitutional constraints or alliances. His moment of victory stands, however, in the face of heavy democratic legacy and international crises, which have become ticking time bombs left by an administration some say brought little democracy to the fore.
And to continue our discussion tonight, let me remind you, dear viewers, that we're talking live with Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Associate Dean Professor of International Studies from California State University, USA. And we're also joined live just now by Mr. Mohammed Chris Sassi, Financial and Geopolitical Analyst from New York, USA. And from Washington, D.C. is Mr. Eugene Chasovsky, Senior Director at New Lines Institute. Equally from Washington, D.C. is Mr. J. Michael Springman, author and political analyst. All right, let me get back to you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, since you've been with us in the first part, and before we get into the discussion of the first report that discusses the issue of unity between USA and Europe, I would like to get back to what is straining American people. I mean, the war in Ukraine, the war on Gaza, taxpayers or the average taxpayer in USA seems to complain, just like Donald Trump highlighted in his presidential campaign, that a lot of money is actually invested in fueling those wars instead of actually finding a solution to them. And that is actually backfired on the West and backfired even on the pocket of the average American, Dr. Hamoud Sarhi.
It's a very, very interesting question, Karim, and it's really, it addresses the very fundamental beliefs of Americans. And the idea of huge spending on wars versus spending on issues of that benefits society. On the one hand, there is, a reasonable answer is that the United States sees itself as a major superpower. So these are sort of put in a perspective of needed to protect United States allies, its geostrategic assets. And it is, as Americans, and we're told that this is for just wars, that we are there to protect the democracies, and the world is threatened by democracies, by authoritarianism and things like that. But there are also deeper issues. I think when you look at how Americans looked at the war in Vietnam at a time when that war was broadcast live on television, and Americans saw what wars meant. When the American soldiers at the end of the Vietnam Wars came back, they were seen and portrayed in many places, wherever they were seen, as baby killers. The Americans could not tolerate viewing images of Americans involved in killing other people. And it took years, probably a decade, more than a decade after the end of the Vietnam War, to build a memorial, the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. So in the meantime, what we've seen also is the idea of the military is able or has been able to dissociate itself or to create a new image of itself that serves the country, the idea of differentiating between the Pentagon and the average American, eliminating the idea of obligatory service, and then integrating some of the budget and some of the funding at universities and schools in policies that would force universities, for example, to take actions or to accept certain proposition in favor of getting some funding, meaning that the changes in how the military, the Pentagon, began to portray itself, becoming more as an integrated, integrated in the society. People go in to be all they can be, getting degrees, all of that. That helped. And then later on, what we've seen is, the whole media. Today, for example, soldiers are embedded at wars. And and we look at the idea of how we portray wars, the war games that we have. All this made it acceptable. So I know I give you a long answer, but the short of it is that during the Vietnam War, Americans felt their involvement. They were directly affected by their taxes, by their bodies, all of that, and therefore people rejected the wars. Today, the war is watched on television. The Iraqi war was seen as as another film, and so the Americans are not directly affected, or they don't feel they're directly affected, and explaining it will not sort of help. And that's I think the main reason why we're tolerating war the way we do, despite the impact of the economy and our life in general.
Thank you indeed. And let me share with you this highlight. China has reiterated that its policy toward the United States remains consistent, emphasizing the importance of mutual respect in its dealings with Washington. In response to a question about the potential impact of the U.S. presidential election results on bilateral relations, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Nao stated on Wednesday that the election is an internal matter for the U.S. and that China respects the choice of American people.
China's U.S. policy is consistent and clear. We view and handle our relations with the U.S. under the principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation.
Mr. Eugene Chosovsky, how do you see the future of the bilateral relations between China and USA? And can Donald Trump really meet the promises he made on deterring China's dominance and protecting national economy, as well as imposing those tariffs he kept talking about? And what kind of consequences do you foresee if he actually fulfills that promise?
Yes, thank you, Kareem. So I would say that the issue on China for the U.S., perhaps unlike some of the other hotspots around the world, whether that be the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, this is probably something that has the most bipartisan consensus. So I think that we're probably going to see the least amount of shifts, at least in the near term, when it comes to U.S. policy vis-a-vis China. Now, Trump has said that, obviously raising tariffs and other kind of economic restrictions, by the way, not only on China, but also countries around the world, including some allies like the Europeans and even neighbors like Mexico and Canada. But certainly China will be one of the main points of focus from the Trump administration when it comes to those economic restrictions in the form of tariffs and other things. And so I think that we'll probably see an increase in hybrid forms of competition when it comes to trade, when it comes to technology controls, things of that nature. But we've seen also how, moving from the first Trump administration into the Biden administration, a lot of the policies that were enacted by Trump in the first place were not only maintained, but also increased by the Biden administration. And this is probably what we're going to see move even further in this next Trump administration as the U.S.-China relationship continues to dominate essentially the global system, and that competition spreads around the world.
Thank you indeed. And Mr. Michael Springman, what will the key features of U.S. foreign policy with China in particular be during the next 4 years of Trump's presidency? How do you foresee it yourself?
Well, I foresee American policy towards China as being at present a series of cumulative mistakes going back originally to American business exporting jobs, exporting capital, exporting technology to China, and then wringing their hands when China has become a major economic power and is taking markets away from the United States. The American response to this is not to penalize the American firms who are exporting jobs, who are exporting tax money. But what they're doing is they are now claiming that China is a great danger, which we ourselves had created, and it must be stopped. The Chinese are being harassed unmercifully and antagonized unmercifully, politically, economically, and militarily, especially militarily, with American warships traveling in Chinese territorial waters, making a point of sailing between Taiwan, the Republic of China, and the People's Republic mainland, which does nothing but inflame the Chinese government. The American government opposes China asserting itself in a number of fly-speck islands and fortifying them and building them up in the region, of course, in the South China Sea, not the South American Sea. Additionally, the Americans don't seem to realize that there are an awful lot of Chinese out there, and that a war with China in their home waters would be disastrous for the United States. American warships would become targets. The Americans, for some idiot reason, are building up the Republic of China, Taiwan, to be a counterweight to the People's Republic, and that's not possible. But the Americans are arming them and interfering in essentially Chinese domestic policy, because both the People's Republic and the Republic of China both assert that there is only one China. So the Americans are looking for trouble, and they're going to find it. And at the same time, they're waging war against the Russian Federation at the other end of the world, and supporting the genocide of the Zionist entity in West Asia. So the Americans are in over their heads, have no concept of what their own interests are, have no concept of what Chinese or Russian or anyone else's interests are, and expect that they will go along in a unipolar world, which has collapsed already, and it will be very painful and very expensive for the United States to continue as it does.
Thank you indeed. Let me bring Mr. Mohammed Krish Sassi to the discussion. Mohammed, will the new occupant of the White House shift Washington's approach to its relations with Western allies in general, similar to what we saw during the previous term?
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry, say it again.
Yes, okay, let me catch up on that question. I was wondering whether the new occupant of the White House, Donald Trump, would actually shift Washington's approach to its relations, maybe with Western allies, similar to what we saw during his previous term, that is.
Well, I think the policy of Trump, we know his policy for the first presidency. And he was not that kind with Europe in general. Specifically, if you remember all the issues that you have with NATO, and you remember this exchange that you have with Merkel and Macron. Of course, he did have the Hungarian on his side, but still, in my point of view, you have an uncertain challenge regarding the relation with Trump. I'm talking about NATO because it's very important, economically as well as for the security of the world. Donald Trump is coming back to the White House, and is going to likely transform the military mission to Europe. So his relationship with NATO and also with this advisor in the Pentagon, they want to assist, and they want to also assist what's going on right now in Europe, specifically with the war in Ukraine. Trump, who won on Tuesday presidential election in a dominant showing that also say Republican, they are going to take the Senate as well. So he's going to have a new position to settle business that he didn't finish in his first term from 2017 to 2021. So the pressure is very intense on the allies in Europe, on the defense and also on the economic side. In Europe, Trump was widely perceived as very, very, I'm saying quote unquote, a dangerous partner that he can left them in one way or another. Yesterday we were talking about the 2%, etc. Now in terms of, I'm sorry?
I didn't say anything, Mr. Mohammed Sassi, continue.
You know, the sound is very strange, and I hear a lot of...
yeah, sorry about that. It might be a technical problem.
Okay, let me continue. The right response in your question, if the right is my humble opinion, is that you have to take a deep breath with the return of Trump regarding Europe. Myself, as a banker, and it was a lot of issues between the two entities from London to Paris to Wall Street. Now the facts are there. Let's say what Trump is going to do to, again, take this new, how can I say that, his return. Because, of course, I can have a small word also. Trump pulled off an incredible comeback. Myself, I'm surprised the way, the landslide of his winning. 4 years after leaving the White House, basically as a black sheep, now he came back with all the red. The map of the election is basically all red, and I think he's, malgré the charge that he's facing, so on and so forth, he was elected because, talking about economy, he touched the fiber of the American, and because he said he's going to fight against not only China and Russia China specifically.
So the bottom line is that we might expect actually a change and a shift in the foreign policy. Let me just ask Mr. Eugene this. Trump has been vocal in his criticism of Washington's approach to Taiwan, and I just wonder, do you think maybe the tensions in the South China Sea will intensify over the next 4 years under his leadership?
Yes, I think that those tensions were heading in that direction regardless of who was going to win the presidential elections. But certainly, Trump comes in with, a more assertive foreign policy vis-a-vis China. He was the one who began the trade war, which, as I mentioned previously, was continued by the Biden administration. I think when it comes to the issue of Taiwan, there is concern, amongst Taiwan and some of its allies, some of the U.S. allies in the region, like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, over Trump's, continuation of that support. I think that certainly, he is more transactional when it comes to U.S. relationships, including with allies, like we talked about with Europe and even Asian ones as well. And so, just given China's rise and U.S. Efforts to forestall that rise or to compete with China economically in the security realm, we've seen a lot of activity. I think it was not a coincidence that China became very assertive, whether it was airspace or in maritime territory, not only in the South China Sea but also in some areas around Japan. And even some major military drills around Taiwan to simulate an economic blockade and things of that nature. So given that we have seen a lot of that hybrid activity already in the past year especially, I think that is going to intensify, hopefully not into a military conflict, because I think that Trump has indicated he wants to wind those down, whether in Ukraine or elsewhere around the world. But certainly we're going to see economic dimensions, I'm sure cyber dimensions, and even some, below the radar kinetic dimensions of that standoff between the U.S. and China in Taiwan and in that Indo-Pacific theater in general.
Thank you indeed. Let me now turn to Dr. Hamoud Salhi. Now, what do this failing administration attempts and measures when it comes to managing the wars worldwide, when we speak about the war in Ukraine, when we speak about the war on Gaza and the aggression against Lebanon, what do these indicators tell us about the previous administration, and can we be hopeful and optimistic about what is coming, or it's just going to be a continuation of the same thing?
I think you have to look at how Trump will govern and how he will lead American foreign policy. Key issues at the appointment, who is going to be in charge of this foreign policy. The other thing we also need to look at in the context where we are going to have probably a majority of Republicans. Now we know the Senate is Republican, and then the House possibly will be the Republican will keep their lead there. So you have power that Trump could use and could force his way by enacting certain bills and some policies. Those are sort of very, very important to look at. But you also have to consider that you could say there are different centers of American foreign policy. There is the Pentagon, and then the State Department, and now the White House. What we've seen in recent years is that the shift of making foreign policy is with has shifted to the White House, where the president or the Secretary of State play a major role in foreign policy, and we've seen this in recent times. But America is also institutional. You have institutions that are sort of safeguard, and there is a process connected to that. Is that American foreign policy is described or can be seen more in terms of continuity than change. So just as Biden built on Trump foreign policy, be it in the Middle East or elsewhere, Trump will find himself in the same position. So these are very, very interesting times. What's very, very important to look at is that we are at a major sort of change in technology, where you have the artificial intelligence is taking over. That means introduction of drones into the war and all of that. And you have all these wars that you've seen, and his promise to say, I want these wars to be over.
And just to catch up on points you mentioned, you did say that USA is a country of institutions and so on and so forth. But what about the presidential decrees that Donald Trump seems to be in love with?
Yeah, and a lot of people blamed Biden for not using them, and it showed that he is not able to stand against the Republican. I don't think the president-elect Trump will be in a position to use the executive orders because he could have those through the Congress, and that's.
And what about the Congress if it has the majority of Republicans? Don't you think that they will back him up?
They will back him up. That's why he will not need the executive order, because the Congress will make that decision. But here's a very interesting point, Karim. What we've seen, Trump is good in conflict situations. In other words, he needed Democrats to be against him so that he could promote himself, creating this controversy, this interest. Now you have a homogeneous relationship between the White House and Congress. In other words, there is no conflict. I think this will disturb Trump approach, and we might see as a different dynamics in how relationships are carried out. There will be less, there are executive orders that he has to take, particularly those that are already in place, which will be eliminated as soon as he takes over. But he will use less of them because he will use the Congress to do the job for him. And it's better to have a bill or law than have an executive order.
Since we're talking about foreign relations here, let me include the Iran file here. Iran, which confirmed on Wednesday that Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. presidential election will not impact the lives of regular Iranians. In a statement, Iranian government spokeswoman Fatima Mohajerani downplayed concerns over Trump's win, stating that Iran is not overly worried about his presidency and that the livelihoods of Iranians will remain unaffected by the election results. This statement came shortly after Trump declared his victory in the election.
The US presidential election doesn't have a significant direct impact on us, as the overall policies of both the US and the Islamic Republic of Iran are relatively stable. Major changes aren't likely to occur due to change of leaders. Preparations and necessary forecasts were made in advance, anticipating that there wouldn't be a shift in people's living conditions. So it doesn't matter much who is elected president in the US.
Very interesting statement indeed. Mohammed Sassi, if we're talking about Iran, we have to bring up the nuclear file on the one hand. We can also bring up the sanctions that Donald Trump imposed on Iran further to kind of deter them from whatever policies or hidden agendas he thinks they have. So according to you, is really Iran going to be safe from Trump's more sanctions, especially that he highlighted that were it not, or were he in the White House, the war in Gaza would not have happened, mainly hinting that because the sanctions were lifted from Iran and hence they somehow financed Hezbollah and the resistance in Palestine to conduct what happened in October 7th. What can you say about that?
Well, as you said rightly, you named the two main issues, and they are likely to dominate the regional agenda for the next Trump administration: Iran and Israeli-Palestinian affair. The focus of this assessment, if you see the separate analysis for in the Trump campaign already, he did some statements on the key issue. I will try here to be clear on the first one with Iran. From my point of view, Trump believes the United States should prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And he has voiced his criticism against the Biden administration. And he has criticized Iran destabilization action across the region. He said that Iran was doing the war by proxy. And then, after Israel's latest retaliatory strike against Iran on October 26, Trump expressed support for Israel to defend itself against threat posed by Iran, which is a continuation of the line of thought of the US in general, but specifically Trump was talking to the Israeli extreme right cabinet. Here we have the key position of his statement. Number one, arguing that Iran attacked Israel, and he will prevent that. That is not going to happen again. So we have here a consistent narrative advanced by Trump, and that the world is more chaotic today than when he was in the office during the first term. And then, when you look at this statement, the Iranian attack on Israel, Trump declared that the world is on fire and spiraling out of control. And then he asserted in his point of view that this war was totally, could I say that, preventable, and it should have never happened if he were president. He would not have happened. He said that also about Ukraine because he's a friend of Putin. And then how he's going to make the case that Iran have access. And of course he's blaming already the Biden-Harris policy. And he said that him and his Vice President Vance, they will argue that Iran regime have more cash today than it was under his first presidency. So, of course, I'm not here to name the documentary that you can see on Fox News, etc., etc. This is propaganda. Now, he said that he's going to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapon. And I would like to know how he's going to do that. Because one of his press conferences in New York, it was, if my memory doesn't play tricks on me, it was on September 26th, Trump said that Iran would have made a deal with us. And the only thing, if he cannot make that deal because he doesn't want them to have nuclear weapon whatsoever, any kind of nuclear weapon. And on October 4, he did comment that Biden, again and again, was supporting basically what Iran was doing, and it was because of the Iran nuclear facilities that they have been able to attack Israel. So that's, regarding the Iranian situation. Now I can have a word about the Israeli-Palestinian affair. Trump.
Yes, we can get back to that, Mr. Mohammed Sassi, as I would like to continue on the same file with Mr. Eugene Chosovsky. How do you see, what is your reading on the Iranian nuclear file when Donald Trump is back to the White House? And how do you think he will manage to stop the whatever he called like hidden agendas and proxy wars?
Right. Well, I think when it comes to the situation with Iran, we can see clearly the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was quite congratulatory for the Trump victory. We know that Trump has placed a lot of pressure on Iran, whether that be via sanctions or even via security measures, and that can be expected to resume. I think, from one perspective, Israel has already done a lot of damage to a lot of the groups supported by Iran in the region, obviously Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon and other areas as well. And so the question is how far the Trump administration will go to contain or try to even push, further. There's been some mixed support. Obviously, the U.S. as a whole has maintained its security support for Israel, although there's been some, more recently, some more constraints to that in terms of, threatening to withhold some of that aid and things of that nature over humanitarian reasons. I think there will be less, constraints on Israel with the Trump administration, and how far that pressure campaign will go, whether that's related to the nuclear program or even Iran's conventional military capabilities. We'll see that, I think, fairly early on in the new administration. However, I will note that Trump campaigned on a platform of ending conflicts, on even, as you mentioned before, preventing conflicts. I think we'll see a lot of movement on that in the Ukrainian theater. Now, in the Middle Eastern theater, that pressure on Iran could actually go the other way and exacerbate the military dimension of the conflict. So I think it's going to be a pretty messy situation. There's already, a number of different theaters that have been opened. And of course, we know that the diplomatic front, with the Trump administration starting those Abraham Accords process, with Israel, expanding diplomatic relations with many Arab countries and seemingly on the verge of doing that with Saudi Arabia. And now that's been kind of reversed at this point. So I think that there's a lot of very complex webs here that will be seen, I think, in that first few months or the first year of the Trump administration.
And Mr. J. Michael Springman, how do you see yourself the regional conflict in the Middle East? Do you really expect that the regional war is going to expand? So not only we have at the Gaza front where the carnage and genocide is taking place, and at the same time, we see the aggression on Lebanon and even some attacks on Yemen and Iraq. Do you see that the region might actually catch fire when Donald Trump is there? Or maybe he will, let's say, steer away from Biden's policy that actually fueled all this from the very beginning?
Well, in my view, the stability of the region, the expansion of the wars that are going on, are essentially under the control of the United States of America. It is the United States which gives the terrorist entity of Israel $49 million a day. They have been given, I think, something like $18 billion in the last few months for weapons, for economic support, and for their efforts to attack Iran, their efforts to destroy Syria, their efforts to destroy Lebanon, their efforts to destroy what's left of Palestine. The issue is the Israelis with their atomic bombs, nobody knows how many. They are the only nuclear power in the region. The Israelis with their deadly bacteria, nobody knows how much. The Israelis with their poison gas, nobody knows how much. Are the problem in the area. And they are a problem because they exist solely on the whim of the United States. Cut off their money, take their weapons away, don't give them bombs wrapped in depleted uranium casings that will poison Lebanon. for centuries to come. Put an end to this, and we will have peace. We will have an effort to restore the economies and the political and territorial integrity of the countries in the area. Keep supporting them, and the war will expand. Iran is conducting a forward defense of itself by advising and assisting and giving counsel and some supplies to the resistance movement, to the axis of resistance in Lebanon, in occupied Palestine, in Syria, and in Iraq, and in Yemen, the poorest country in the world, which is the only Arab country which is fighting back against the Israeli entity. So we need to look at things in a more realistic sense. We need to deal with things as they are, not as we wish them to be. And if the United States truly is interested in peace in the area, they will stop and put an end to the Israeli aggression and their murderous satanic activities.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Michael Springman. Mr. Mohammed Kristasi, we are nearing the end. I want you to give us a concluding statement on that thought.
Yes, just to follow what was said about Iran. Iran is defending itself, and if Trump thinks that is going to stop their program for nuclear power is only wishful thinking. Specifically, just to add a point that you didn't talk, you have a new front now that it was open. Don't forget that Russia did something diplomatically a very great success in my point of view when he put Saudi Arabia and Iran together, and to have this coalition to do a front against the Israeli US hegemony. Now, the policy of Trump is not going to change from the policy of America for the last 20 or 30 years. But one thing I would like to see if how Gaza is going to be looked at comparatively to how Ukraine is looked at by Trump. And then I think it will open a lot of new front. Even maybe China will be involved in the area due to the spread of Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. When is going to end? The balance of power has to come back.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Mohammed Kristasi. We reach the end of tonight's special. Thank you to our panelists for their valuable insights and perspectives on this pivotal election, and to our viewers for keeping it here on our channel. Until next time, do take care.